In the last section, we used the reduce helper to sum up all of the numbers in an array. Let's try out a slightly more complicated example this time and see if we can't shed a little bit more light on how the reduce helper works. So this time around, I'm going to create an array of objects called primary colors. So I'll make primary colors, and it's going to be an array of objects. So color of red, yellow, and finally blue. So I want to take every element, or every object out of here, and I want to collect all the values off of each. Okay, so I want to get red, yellow, and blue. In other words, at the end of the day, I want to end up with an array like red, yellow, and blue. Now we could certainly achieve this by using the map helper, but this time around I want to try doing it using reduce instead. Okay, so we're going to do this just a little bit differently. So we'll start out with writing our reduce helper. So we'll say primary colors dot reduce, and we'll pass it our function. So the number one step of whenever we're using the reduce helper is we need to think about what that default or starting argument, or that starting value, the second argument to reduce is. So in the last example, we started with 0 because we were summing up a list of numbers. And so it made sense to start with a number of 0, and then we can just add on each element each time. This time around, we want to end up with an array of strings. So an array of like red, yellow, and blue. Because our return value is going to be an array, I think that it makes a lot of sense to start off with an array here instead of a number. So that answers what we should put down for our default value here. Now we need to fill in the arguments for the inner function. Remember, when we're using reduce, this is the only time so far out of all the helpers we've spoken about where the argument signature changes a little bit. So when we're using reduce, the first argument is this object that keeps getting carried through, or this kind of like returned value that keeps on coming through every iteration. And then the second argument is the object in the array. So I would probably put on here, I would probably say something like previous and primary color as the second argument. One thing that trips me up personally very frequently is what to name this first argument on here. So for us, it represents this kind of default or starting value that gets passed through the loop every single time. So sometimes I'll use previous. I'll sometimes also use ACC, which is short for accumulator, because that's kind of what it's doing here. It's accumulating values as we iterate through the loop. I've also seen people go with mem. Not entirely sure what that one stands for, but I think it's no, I really can't say what that one's good for. So you might see different labels here for the first argument, but I think what makes the most sense a lot of time is to just say previous. This is the previous value when we last went through this loop. Okay. So now, like I said, we want to take all the strings out of each of these objects and stuff them into this array. So previous is an array, so I'll use previous.push primary color dot color. And then remember, just like every other helper that we've spoken about, the absolute key inside of here is to make sure that we use the return keyword. So we will return previous. So we made some change to previous and then we returned it. The reduce helper is that one time where we start to kind of violate that rule of wanting to have no mutation of any of our data. So this helper that we're passing, not this helper, but this object that we're passing through here, totally fine to mutate it as we walk throughout the array. So you can see here when we do previous.push, we are clearly mutating previous to make the array that we're trying to build. After we mutate the array, we then return it, and so previous is then going to come back in as the second or as the first argument on the next iteration through. We then push on another color, return the whole array, and it comes on through the third time through. And so eventually we end up with the strings of red, yellow, and blue. All right, so yeah, reduce, okay, seems interesting, or seems kind of interesting, right? Seems maybe useful, I don't know. Let's continue the next section and talk a little bit about some practical use cases of the reduce helper.